All right. Thanks for letting us be here today. There's so much we could say about this topic, so much. But we'll start with some basic principles here. Our historical moment is marked by a crisis of incivility. I think most people would agree. Many books and articles about civility and incivility, rudeness and lack of respect, books on bullying, and other topics appear in increasing numbers. The workplace, the political sphere, educational institutions, no context is free from the strife of incivility. But we have been here before. In 17th century New England, for instance, people disputed about religion in the public sphere, and people were so concerned about rending of the social fabric. And that seems to be where we are now, but it's not just religious questions, it's many other questions as well, stemming from differences. And that, of course, makes our educational institutions increasingly contested terrain. So what do we do? First of all, we recognize that our moment, although not new, is different in some ways. The rise of social media, social communication technologies, faster and faster communication, new generations who respond to different norms for interaction. We don't know sometimes what the norms for interaction are, or what the norms for civility might be. So content expertise, while of course very important, is insufficient for educators who are trying to reach a generation of students with a different set of norms than their own, and who hail from varied demographic and identity affiliations. And of course, for students entering a global workforce, where getting along with persons not like themselves in multiple ways is no longer an option. It is a marketplace imperative. So civility is about protecting and promoting public discourse in this particular historical moment. We believe that civility is a response that can help us protect and promote participation in civic life or in public life. When implemented constructively, of course, civility can support and nourish participation in public life. And the classroom is a microcosm of that public life. That's one of the main points that we'd like to make today. It's a microcosm. The classroom is a microcosm of public life. So today we're going to highlight some different understandings of civility and offer a framework that will be helpful for approaching civility in the classroom, and then situate the material in the context of a communication ethics literacy. First of all, civility as an enduring ideal. The ideal of civil discourse or civic discourse or civility is an enduring ancient ideal reaching back centuries. Law professor and public intellectual Stephen Carter points to Erasmus, the 16th century Dutch humanist, as one of the first proponents of shared standards for civil conduct. George Washington, as many of you may know, at about the same age as a traditional college student, weighed in on the issue of civility in his book, Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. The practice of civility is focused on the pragmatic reality that we live together in human community. That's our fate as human beings. We have to live together, which means we have to attend to the legitimate concerns and sensibilities of others. Carter, once again, defines civility as the sum of the many sacrifices we are called to make for the sake of living together. Philosopher Cheshire Calhoun notes that civility fits citizens for life in a pluralistic society that requires tolerance in the face of deep disagreement about the good, and involves accommodation and compromise, as well as self-restraint, placing limits on one's speech. But civility isn't just about holding back. It's not about things we shouldn't do. It's also an active process that involves listening attentively and intently and intentionally to others with whom we disagree, trying to understand their positions. That can be hard, especially when the issues we disagree about are deeply rooted and matter to us. Civility involves respect for others even when we don't share their perspectives. Now, in the academy, in the academic world, civility is a contested terrain. It's a contested term. For some, it speaks of class distinctions, the hegemonic control and disenfranchisement of those with less power by those with more power through control of acceptable style and content of communication, or just as problematic, an unreflective adherence to or obedience to community norms that eclipses concerns for participatory justice. For others, it speaks of an aversion to controversial topics that might provoke the unpleasantness and discomfort of disagreement, which, as we know in this day and age, would mean pretty much not to talk at all. Then, if you follow Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, 17th century advocate of religious freedom, understood as civility, or understood, Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island in the 17th century, understood civility as a confrontational, passionate advocacy of ideas in the public square with the aim of persuading others. Everyone must talk, and talk a lot. But what about education? That's the topic for today. This has been a rather lengthy background, but I think it's necessary to establish what we'll talk about next. So we're thinking about these understandings of civility as potentially problematic. But if we think about, it's all about hegemonic control of the powerless by the powerful, we all need some kind of guidelines, whoever we may be, to accomplish tasks together. Every culture has rules for politeness, ways of getting things done together. So civility can be generated by anyone. It's not necessarily just a class control of discourse. There are ways also of using civility to promote or permit authentic change. In fact, Connolly, the educator, says, wow, civility can speak truth to power and bring about change. Civility doesn't just mean being quiet and letting people run roughshod over others. It means working within the guidelines, as Martin Luther King Jr. did, to bring about change. And the other point is civility is all about squashing discourse and not talking about controversial topics. Well, I would agree with that. We would agree that if you simply remain quiet about controversial issues, you'll stop the heart of education, because critical thinking, which is one of the key cognitive skills that we try to teach our students, is all about questioning, challenging, offering alternatives. So it's about critical thinking. But I believe, and many of you I'm sure do as well, it is possible to have pretty vigorous arguments and still work within guidelines and limits that permit people to engage those ideas without screaming, yelling, or resorting to other kinds of violence. Now, there is an approach that Roger Williams took, and that was civic discourse. Civility is all about making your ideas heard in the public sphere. Don't tread lightly. Break those eggshells. Let it out. Persuade others. Everybody talk a lot. That was the description that I had used. For some educators, that feels a little too disruptive. It doesn't feel like education. It feels like maybe a form of debate that is focused on winning at all costs rather than listening to others. And if we do listen to others, it's just so we can find out what's wrong with their position and then tear it down. So what could we offer instead? What is an alternative that we could consider? One would be to think about Arnett and Arneson's dialogic civility. And Ron Arnett is going to be here in a few moments. I expect him to pop through the door at any second, but I will take his place for the moment. Arnett and Arneson's dialogic civility, an approach to civil discourse that recognizes differences and seeks to learn from the ideas of others. The work that he and Leeanne Bell and I have done, Leeanne Bell McManus and I have done on communication ethics literacy, recognizes that we live in a world of narrative and virtue contention. We don't agree on what is good for human life and conduct, yet we must work together as a human community to forge ways of accomplishing life together. Such a goal requires learning about and from difference with the hope that some common ground may emerge. In the classroom, the common ground is learning. The common center is learning, acquiring knowledge about a content area or a subject, or gaining applied knowledge of a profession or an intellectual practice. Now, if we're going to have civility in the classroom, it's helpful to have support for civility at the institutional level. And I don't know what institution all of you may be from, but I know at least at Duquesne, there's some emphasis on civility, and I know at other educational institutions there are some concerns for appropriate discourse or promoting learning in a constructive environment. So it helps to have institutional support. Faculty members, though, can set the parameters at the local level. There are no fixed rules for pedagogical civility, but instructors need to model the way. If the classroom is a community and civility is care for a community, then faculty members can begin by modeling through a metaphor that Richard Sennett promoted or provided as the craft workshop. The craft workshop, where you have experts, craft experts, who are teaching the next generation how to do that practice, how to do that craft. In the liberal arts, we believe that critical thinking, discussing ideas, learning from others, and learning content is that practice. When instructors evaluate, this is really important, and I think all of you take this into account, especially if you're in the communication field, which I believe most of you are. There are ways of giving constructive feedback that reflect what Sennett described as sociable expertise. Sociable expertise, which is an invitational, caring, concerned way of saying, hey, I know you want to get this right. This is what you need to fix. This is how to make it much better. Here's the challenge that you're facing. Here's what you can do. Now, that kind of sociable expertise is a kind of pedagogical civility that is the opposite from what Sennett calls an antisocial expert, that seeks to humiliate a learner who is trying her best to get it right, maybe messes up lots of times. And that's hard. We can be frustrated occasionally with our students. But if we put on that model of the sociable expert, we find a way to keep trying to help that student get it right. What is it? Notice everything, overlook much, change a little. Notice everything, overlook much, change a little. So the first point about pedagogical civility is that we as instructors need to model that civility and show the way. Given that, what's next? How can we protect and promote learning in the classroom through pedagogical civility? We're thinking now about the guidelines that we may lay out. And oh my goodness, Dr. Arnett is here. We're just now talking about guidelines in the classroom.
Oh, that's nice.
Here he is. Welcome, welcome. We're thinking about guidelines for discussion that we could set on the first day of class.
Yes.
Because that can be helpful. And some people want the students to make up the rules, because if they generate the rules, then they feel more like following them. It's something that we've generated as a whole. Well, what would you think about that, Dr. Arnett?
I think there are. We go. Move this.
There we go.
There we go. I think there are a few things that need to be worked through in terms of asking students, what do you think? But I think the instructor really needs to establish some guidelines, because it's an issue of not only ethics but justice, and ethics is taking care of interpersonal issues as we deal with individual people. Justice is making sure that the learning environment is healthy for everyone, and I think that's one of the elements of classroom leadership, is to make sure that that is the case, and trying to come with rules that include everyone. Is important.
Good. Some of the things, too, recommended might be to offer explicit definitions and examples of unacceptable and acceptable practices. You can say these comments are off limits. or these ways of framing questions, instead of saying, "Oh, what a stupid idea," or "Where'd you learn that?" or "Is that even true?" You could say, "That's interesting. Where did you hear that?" or "What's the evidence that you found to support that position?" That's a way of practicing supportive wording of questions and challenges and expressed disagreements.
And you do that incredibly well in the classroom.
Oh, well, thank you. Meta-communication. You can talk about the talk. I heard you make this comment. How do you think that might make immigrants feel? If you were someone new to a country, how would that comment make you feel? It's a type of meta-communication. Or taking another point of view, we know what meta-communication is. It's communication about communication. Discernment and tact. Sometimes you don't take on issues directly in the classroom. Isn't that right? If something comes up, you may find a way to overlook it, but talk to someone afterwards outside of the class. What do you think?
I think one of the skills that's really important to learn is how to give people space. And you need to give them space to learn. And if indeed you allow someone to lose space in the classroom, you may have difficulty ever getting that person back. So the discernment is how to give someone space in a given place and how to talk to them in a safer location. The key is always long-term growth, not short-term satisfaction of an instructor or a given person.
Oh, that's wonderful. I like that. Encourage student leadership. You mentioned leadership. Instructors are leaders, but we can also encourage students or praise them for things they've done well. There are what we might call microbursts of student leadership or student civility. When we see it occurring, we can encourage it. We don't always have to point it out explicitly, but we can give the nonverbal encouragement or the thanks that way. We can ask for student feedback, especially if topics are controversial. Not every class is going to have controversial topics. Some will. And it may be helpful to ask how students are doing, how students are responding. I remember one instance in class when some comments emerged. This was 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And students were vigorously engaged, and they were a little bit upset. And so I asked them to write down their responses to what had just happened. And I offered it as a learning opportunity for them to think about how they responded to that difficult moment. And then, of course, I bought pizza the next class day and had them eat together, and that was an eye-opening experience for me. Some of the students said, "I feel like I'm in college now. We're talking about these important issues." Others said, "You should never have had that student stand in front of the class and make those comments. That was a place of authority." I learned so much. So for me, that particular conflict was a learning opportunity, and I hope it was a learning opportunity for the students. I do believe, and I don't know, Leeanne, if you think this is the case or Ron, that if if students see an instructor striving to promote civil discourse in the classroom, to include others, to admit mistakes, to try to get people to cooperate, then the students may be propelled to do the same. I think that is the case. Do you think that's the case, Leeanne?
One of the things that we talk about in my classroom is the issue of space and grace. It's the idea that we take into consideration that this is a learning opportunity for everyone, including the instructor. So we talk about what it's like to be in a communication ethics classroom where there are controversial topics that are brought up by students. And it is our opportunity to learn from each other and see things from all sides of the perspective. And we have to give a little grace sometimes because they may say something that is offensive, but we have to let them know that it might be offensive because they don't always know that it is in those particular moments.
Isn't that the case? We don't know. We often don't know what we may say could strike someone another way, which is why we teach students to say, time out, you may not have known it, but that offended me, and let me tell you why. And then another student can say, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that." Some people talk about the ouch and oops. I don't know if that sounds kind of hokey, ouch, oops, stepped on me in some way. That's very helpful. Ron, what do you think?
No, I'm just listening. This is well done. Yeah.
Welcoming mistakes.
Yeah.
Welcoming mistakes. People, if we just, are afraid to say anything, we'll never say anything at all, but we can work through it. What is it, the old saying? Sometimes the only way to get to the next point is through it. You can't go around it. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You just have to go through it. And perhaps at the end of the class, the students will say, that was hard. That was sometimes painful, but we would do it again. We would do it again. So we could end this part of the presentation by quoting again from the Arnett and Arneson book, The Unity of Contraries Between Cynicism and Hope. Cynicism arises from unmet high expectations. We want our students to know that the learning environment may sometimes be painful. It won't always be happy, but it will be meaningful. And the hope is that people will learn and we can make the world a better place, because human beings are certainly capable of great evil, as we have witnessed in Pittsburgh just the last few days. And I won't say more or I will cry. But we're also capable of great good. And I think we can make a difference. As educators, we can bring that gift to our students. The civility part of the classroom is the relational part. The content part, the information part is the content that we bring, but we need both. We know that. We need the content and the relationship. And if we attend to both, then we can make a difference. Leeanne, would you like to make some comments about text? Thank you.
So one of the things that we've seen here at Stevenson University is the push for courses in things such as communication ethics. And at our university, we've had the opportunity to have our communication ethics course serve as one of the core requirements for humanities majors and communication majors. So what happens is we're having a course at the 200 level where students from all different majors take the course, and we talk about, some of the things that Janie talked about, setting guidelines in your classroom. And I always set the guidelines in the classroom and then offer students the opportunity to add additional ideas that they think, especially when we're giving presentations about controversial topics, what are some things that the class would like to see respect-wise towards the other presenters. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the textbook, Communication Ethics Literacy, Dialogue, and Difference. The book really focuses on the goods that we protect and promote in various contexts, and it is associated with what is right and or appropriate for humans to be and do. So you can see in the first 5 chapters, what we do is we provide a theoretical framework for the text. So we look at things as, what is postmodernity? What does it mean to live in postmodernity? We look at the history of communication ethics. So how have we studied communication ethics? And then we offer a definition of communication ethics that is situated between a philosophy of communication and an applied communication. So we focus a lot in the classroom, not only on the why, but the how. So why something is important, and then how do we go about achieving certain things? We also look at the different approaches to communication ethics, and we talk about what is a democratic, what is codes, procedures, and standards, universal, humanitarian, contextual, narrative, dialogic, and in this edition of the book, we add standpoint communication to that. We also, in the theoretical framework, look at the idea of what does it mean to have this notion of common sense, and how are we losing the notion of common sense? So what happens when common sense is no longer common in today's world? The next section of the book, we look at chapters 6 through 13, and these are very contextual. So at my school, not everyone who's taking the class is a communication major. So we look at things such as public discourse, interpersonal, organizational, intercultural, business and professional, healthcare, communication ethics, and we integrate some of the ideas on how do we look at communication ethics from these different perspectives. In the second edition, we focus on integrated marketing communication. We added a chapter that looks at why ideas matter and the issue of integration. And we also added a chapter on media ethics, because we're finding lots of students interested in social media and what does it mean to be digitally responsible in the world that we now live in. The last chapter of the book looks at dialogic learning, which is situated within a historical moment of contending goods, people not seeing things the same. And then at the end of each of the chapters, we engage communication ethics through literature. So we use Les Miserables for an example of how we can take some of the ideas that we learn in the text and apply it to literature. And I think what's helpful about using literature as a way to engage the ideas is we're looking at something through a lens in which we can apply those things to certain characters. So that's a little bit about the textbook. I'm now going to turn it back over to Janie and Ron.
All right. I think it might be time for questions and answers.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple questions for you. First one, how can a focus on civility in the classroom be useful for the workplace?
Wow, that's a nice softball question. Thank you for that. What do you think, Ron?
I think the key is productivity, and you want to communicate a space where productivity is possible. And civility is a way to provide a safe conversational space. That doesn't mean that there's agreement. It does mean that one's ideas will be dealt with some element of respect. And that doesn't mean necessarily that there will be consensus at the end. But without some element of civility, I think you drive a lot of backstabbing in an organization, because the kind of things that people would want to say publicly, they will only say privately. So civility is a way to keep your organization, I think, healthy, not only in productivity, but in terms of lessening the issues of interpersonal sabotage.
Oh, yes. That, of course, as we know, the practices that we do feed into the organizational culture and climate. So what we do at that micro level really does make a difference at the larger level. Thank you for that question. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. I know, Janie, you had talked about this in your presentation. We have a chat going online here. For Ron and Leeanne, what's the most difficult situation you've encountered with incivility in the classroom?
For me personally, I'm not a fan of cursing, and I have had presentations last class that were very interesting, where people are very sensitive to topics and they get very emotional, and you can tell that they're very passionate, and sometimes their passion for the topic ends up being sort of uncivil, in a sense, that it's the idea that you become so excited, so passionate about it, that you end up forgetting about the other people who are not as passionate about it, and they become excluded in the conversation. So I think in the classroom, a lot of times when we sort of go off on a tangent, or a student might go off on a certain path, we have to bring them back and talk to them about the importance of learning from these ideas, and what else do we want to talk about, and how does the other side see this?
I think my answer is not very provocative. I'm not sure I've ever had an incident of incivility in the classroom. I think what I've had are students asking questions and trying to engage issues in a helpful way. But if anything, incivility might happen occasionally in small groups, And so if I'm working with controversial material, I would not have it move quickly to the public domain. I would have it move to small groups first, and then I can walk in and intervene and work with people in the small groups. But I've never unleashed intentional controversy over the entire class. In smaller, self-contained groups, it's been easier to handle, and I think because of that, at least I think it's because of that, I've never had a kind of public display of incivility. I think the respectfulness of looking at multiple ideas has been prevalent in the classroom.
I think also your point about small groups, people are experiencing each other in a more immediate context, which may help people become more self-reflective about how they discuss. I don't know if
that's smart. I think I do that intuitively and should have thought about it more analytically, but I think that's accurate.
Well,
yeah.
Well, and that's a great answer for this next question that we got from Facebook, a Facebook viewer. How do you balance protection for conversation in the classroom with the very real potential that someone will say something that upsets another student?
Yeah, wow. I do like what you were saying. You can let's say a controversial issue did arise right there. If you could then say, okay, this is a heated issue. People have opinions about that. Let's move into groups. I want you to talk about that for 7.5 minutes, and then we're going to report back. I mean, that just based on what you said there, that might be one way to do it, is to contain it, but let it happen.
Yeah, Janie has a very fast processor. That's a really good answer. I wish I could have come up with that one. I would steal it.
You might have it.
That's very nice.